to you. So this case, as you just heard from the CASEC Executive Secretary there, Lawson Naidu, it's about the independence of the National Prosecuting Authority. What might we expect today, in particular, about whether or not the Concord judges are going to be divided on this?
Yes, we'll have to wait and see which way the bench leans in terms of their judgment on this matter, but certainly serious ramifications for the integrity and the independence of the NPA. And we must remember that's the authority that decides who gets prosecuted and who doesn't, to put it in simple terms. Now, I'm joined by Pooja Dela, who is the attorney for the Helen Suzman Foundation. They were a friend of the court in this case, as well as the matter in the High Court in December of last year. Pooja, just to start off with, what are the possible outcomes we might hear today from the judges of the Constitutional Court?
Thanks very much. So the court might come to a whole host of decisions. The first being that if they decide that the appointment of Shaun Abrahams is unlawful and invalid, and they decide to set that aside, it might well be that they exercise their remedial discretion and decide that it's not in the interest of justice to remove him from that position. The parties obviously argued very strongly against that. A more likely outcome, we hope, would be that the court sets aside that appointment and reinstates Mr. Nkosana. If the court decides that that's not in the interest of justice, they may well decide that it's for the president to appoint the next National Director of Public Prosecutions.
And if that happens, what becomes of the vacancy? Because the whole issue initially was that because Nkosana exited with this golden handshake of over 17 million rand, there was never a vacancy. He was sort of pushed out with this sweetener, this sort of carrot that was dangled in order to get him to leave a job he didn't want to. So what happens if this position suddenly becomes vacant?
Sure, it's a very good question. It all depends on how the order is worded. Like I said, if the court decides that Mr. Abrahams must vacate his position immediately, there will be a vacancy. It might well mean that one of the 4 deputies are up for an acting position. If the court orders that it's in the interest of justice for him to stay in the position for a very short interim period whilst the president appoints the new NDPP, it's an outcome that is quite plausible.
Now, in the public sort of rhetoric, Shaun Abrahams is often, unfortunately, referred to as Shaun the Sheep. And we know that after President Cyril Ramaphosa came into office, he quickly reinstated charges against the former president, Jacob Zuma. He's argued that he's fit and proper for his position, but you and other NGOs that have been before this court are saying that you want Nkosana back in the role. Why is that?
It's a very simple proposition of law. If the removal of Nkosana was invalid and unlawful, that vacancy was never open, and as such, Mr. Abrahams was never lawfully appointed. And if that is the case, the question is a very simple one as to whether the status quo ante revives. And there's simply no, certainly on the Helen Suzman Foundation's version, no basis, either just or equitable, not to reinstate Mr. Nkosana in that position.
But that's not what the High Court decided, because when they made their judgment in December, they said that it would not be fit and just to reinstate Nkosana, particularly since he'd agreed to this more than 17 million rand golden handshake, the largest of its kind we've seen in the public service. Why do you think differently?
Well, it was quite an odd finding by the High Court, particularly because Mr. Nkosana wasn't allowed to make any submissions in the High Court. And certainly before this court, he was allowed to submit an affidavit. And like I say, the question, the issues before this court was not whether Mr. Abrahams or Mr. Nkosana are fit and proper people. It's simply whether the appointment was lawful and the removal of Mr. Nkosana was unlawful. And once you knock out those 2 dominoes, as a matter of law, Mr. Nkosana should lawfully be reinstated.
Pooja Dela, thank you so much for your time. Of course, partisan in this case, being a representative from the Helen Suzman Foundation. I think what's important there, Xoli, is to remember that the Constitutional Court justices, also in their line of questioning in February, were careful to note that their decision does not necessarily reflect on the capacity, the integrity of Shaun Abrahams in his position, something that some of the parties have argued here. It really comes down to a matter of law and whether there was a vacancy to begin with for him to fill, something he argues there was, but the High Court disagreed with when they made their judgment in December.